Well, welcome to Afternoon Light Live at the Robert Menzies Institute. This is our sixth Afternoon Light Live, a series of online webinars. Well, the 15th of June, which this year falls on Saturday, is Magna Carta Day. And this year, 2025, marks 800 years since the legitimisation of this important document. This is a document that would go on to shape centuries of legal and political thought across the English-speaking world. 50 years ago, in 1965, I'll save you the trouble of the maths, Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, attended the 750th anniversary celebrations for the Magna Carta in London. He explained at the time that the great thing about Magna Carta was that it put into form for the first time something which had been instinctive in Britain since the beginning of time. Few documents in Western civilization have had such an enduring, symbolic, and constitutional impact as Magna Carta. From its origins as a peace settlement between King John and his barons, it has come to represent the foundational principles of liberty under law, due process, and the limits of arbitrary power. It's a document that speaks to the very heart of our liberal democracy. So, to tell us why we should care about this 800-year-old document is the Robert Menzies Institute's own resident historian, Dr. Zachary Gorman, and several-time guest on Afternoon Light Live. Welcome, Zach.
It's good to be here again.
So, Zach, when you're not writing about Robert Gordon Menzies, you have spent a bit of time writing about Magna Carta, including this book in 2021, and we'll make sure that you get the link to this as well. It's Summoning Magna Carta, Freedom's Symbol Over a Millennium. Today's webinar is, of course, being recorded live, and so you, the audience, get a chance to ask questions. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens. Zach and I are going to speak to each other for 30 minutes, and then it's over to you, so please don't be shy. Well, Zach, Magna Carta Day's on Saturday. No doubt you've got big celebrations planned. Tell me about... I was going to say, tell me about 1225, but maybe we should start with 1215 when the actual Magna Carta was signed.
Oh, yeah. So 1215, King John, who you know is a bad king because he's the only King John. There was never a King John II. You've earned a pretty bad reputation at that point. So he's having his barons, so the nobility of England, rebel against him, largely in a tax revolt. So he's been levying these really high taxes because he wants to win back the French lands that the Angevin line of kings that he's a part of used to hold. So that's the reason he's trying to extract all this money out of the populace. But they're not going to take it, not only because of just the sheer amount of money that they're taking, but John does all sorts of awful things like, sleeping with his barons' wives, or starving his nephew to death, all these horrible, like he's a sort of Shakespearean evil character. So what these barons want to do is that they want to rein John in. They want to make him subject to the law. But the problem is that in medieval theory, nobody is above the king. Nobody can dictate to the king what he can and can't do. But what they find is that there is one thing that can sort of dictate to a king, and that is precedent, is actually what previous kings of England have been able to do, what the custom of the land is. And that's what Magna Carta ultimately is. It draws on two documents. One is the Charter of Liberties that Henry I had issued, and another older...
And obviously not a bad king, because there were lots of Henrys.
Oh, yeah. And all very important to Magna Carta. The first three are all essential to the story. It was not just his Charter of Liberties, but before that, these things called the Laws of Edward the Confessor, that to the extent they existed, were actually the law codes codified by Archbishop Wulfstan under Ethelred the Unready and Canute right around the turn of the millennium. Hence the idea that this is freedom's symbol over a millennium, because not only have people for 800 years invoked Magna Carta to sort of claim their freedoms and rights. But even the barons themselves were invoking these older sort of foundational documents. So they were doing the exact same thing that people would later do with Magna Carta itself.
And how did these barons get King John, awful King John, to agree to this Magna Carta, this grand charter?
Well, basically, they won the Civil War. The key event that happens right before Magna Carta is that the rebel barons capture London, and it's the capture of London that actually brings King John to the negotiating table. And the reason that the Magna Carta negotiations take place in Runnymede, which is now a very famous sort of plot of land, even though it's basically just a paddock beside a highway, is because it's this neutral ground, this no man's land between the rebel stronghold in London and where King John was basing his court.
And so what happens after Magna Carta is signed? The sort of barons withdraw and it's peace in the land?
Well, this is the problem, is that nobody can compel a king. So the original Magna Carta has this thing called the security clause, which is these 25 powerful barons who are basically there to enforce Magna Carta, make sure that King John obeys it. And all that means is that they have a license to restart the Civil War if they think King John is not living up to what he's supposed to be living up to.
More a ceasefire than a peace.
Yeah, and it doesn't last particularly long. King John himself goes behind the barons' back and goes to the Pope and gets the Pope to annul Magna Carta because Magna Carta has clearly been signed under duress. He only did this because it was at sword point as opposed to gunpoint. So you can understand that at this point in 1216, it looks as though that Magna Carta will be a document that's just a tiny footnote in history. The barons actually appealed to Prince Louis of France to come and invade England and sort of take over from King John, so that if anything, the Civil War's only going to escalate.
And of course, what gets in the way of a lot of great plans is the inevitability of life, isn't it? It's death.
Yeah, King John very serendipitously passes away, and it's it's a good thing in many ways. It's a good thing because obviously he's a bad king and he's someone that no one wants to support. But because he's been so bad, the few people that are left loyal to him, the few people that are left in his court, are actually really sort of loyalist, really sort of good, hardworking people. And they become the sort of caretaker government while his son, Henry III, is only 9 years old and is obviously not sort of cognitively aware enough to rule yet. And they reissue Magna Carta as a sort of olive branch to the rebels, is let's stop this before we actually have a French king. Hubert de Burgh, who's an important one of these people who are leading the Regency government, he wins a siege at Dover, which ultimately repels the French invasion, which has a Menzies connection because he's ultimately acting as Lord Warden of the Cinque Ports, that same role that Menzies would later succeed Churchill in. And Churchill actually has this fitting tribute to Hubert de Burgh in one of his books called The Island Race. He really loves Hubert de Burgh for defeating the French at this siege of Dover.
Even though the barons had been the ones who had invited the French in to invade England.
Yeah, because Prince Louis had a wife who had a claim to the English throne. So it was still sort of meant to be a legitimate English monarch, even though they were self-evidently French.
Now, I don't want to get too waylaid because there's heaps more to discuss about what is Magna Carta and of course its impact it has on various democracies that we know and love. But I mean these reissues of Magna Carta, I mean, what were they? They were trying to restate it. Is that what it was, or were they adjusting the terms?
Oh, well, certainly the 1225 reissue, the main thing that does is that it's an adult Henry III issuing Magna Carta of his own volition. So this is what makes it legitimate, because it's not being forced upon him, and nor is it being delivered in his name by someone acting for him. This is of his own accord. And there's two other things that are really important in the 1225 reissue. One is that Henry III makes it explicit that he's granting Magna Carta in exchange for a tax. So he wants to levy some money to again try to win back those French lands that they're wasting all this money and lives on, which helps to set this precedent that you actually need to get the consent of the realm to taxation. And that's ultimately through that 13th century where Parliament evolves from that idea. And also because Henry III states that this charter will bind not just him, but all of his successors, that this will be a fundamental law, that this isn't just a one-off thing, that this is going to sort of set the foundation for how the British monarchy is going to function going forward.
You'd said in 1215 that King John had gone to the Pope to annul the first iteration of the Magna Carta. Is the papacy now okay with it because it has been reissued and not under duress?
Yeah, so the papacy actually does a complete 180, and the church becomes really important to Magna Carta getting this place as fundamental law, because the number one the number one with a bullet of Magna Carta is freedom to the church, which is one of the reasons why a lot of people think it was drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, who always refused to go along with the Pope in excommunicating people who supported Magna Carta, and ultimately wins the day in seeing that it's actually a good thing because it will defend the church. It's posted to every single church in England. There are all sorts of elaborate ceremonies they do invoking Magna Carta, and whenever there's a dispute with subsequent kings between the king and the church, they are always quick to pull out Magna Carta.
So now we need to get to the content of Magna Carta. Why is it so significant and so iconic? I mean, we have lots of discussions and perhaps flippant remarks, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdowns, that this is in breach of Magna Carta, and people sort of grasp at various threads of it. But from 1215, and of course from its legitimisation in 1225, what were we seeing here?
There's a few different clauses that have really captured the imagination and stayed relevant over the test of time, because it's a relatively long document. A lot of it is dealing with medieval things that sort of go by the wayside. They sort of date poorly and are not relevant even sort of 50 years later. But the core clauses, one is that there are two types of taxation, scutages and aids, which are basically these medieval feudal taxes that can only be levied with the consent of the realm. So that no taxation without representation ultimately evolves from that line in Magna Carta, even though that's not exactly what it meant in 1215. And the other key clauses are the due process clauses. So one is that you can't be imprisoned, have your goods seized, be exiled, basically have any sort of bad things happen to you by the government, except by the lawful judgment of your peers and according to the law of the land. So that phrase again sort of evolves into an understanding that it guarantees trial by jury and due process. And then it's got a parallel sort of clause that's this idea that to no one will I sell, delay, or deny right or justice. And that's one of the ones that really continues to be invoked in the courts. This idea that you can't delay justice is something that still comes up with the complexities of our legal system and how hard it is to bring cases.
And of course, I guess fundamentally too, this idea that no one is above the law, even the king. So this is a real enduring principle that you can't avoid the law, and we should all respect that, despite the fact that you may have been anointed from heaven or the sun or whatever you believe. So tell me about how the Magna Carta contributed to the birth of Australia's democracy.
Well, it really boils down to that idea of no taxation without representation, which It's not exactly there, but it certainly evolves over the 13th century. And by the time you get to the 1297 reissue, no taxes can be levied in England without a parliament that also features the commons. It's actually the commons more than the barons by 1297 that are giving permission to levy taxation. That still has to be fought out over the English Civil War and various other things. It's not definite. Freedom can only ever be won for one generation, as Ronald Reagan said. But that's the idea. And then this is the idea that obviously the American Revolutionary War fights for no taxation without representation. And the American revolutionaries initially are appealing for the rights of Magna Carta, their rights as freeborn Englishmen. And it's only once those are denied that they appeal to John Locke and abstract rights and life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those sorts of things. But in Australia in the 1850s, where we're having these debates around the ending of convict transportation and ultimately about having true self-government, we invoke, and particularly William Wentworth, who leads a lot of this agitation, he invokes Magna Carta in a famous document he issues to the British government called the Declaration and Remonstrance of 1851. And he not only invokes Magna Carta, but he invokes something called the Taxation of the Colonies Act, 1778, which is basically England realizing that they're going to lose the Revolutionary War and offering the rebels what they wanted in the first place, which is no taxation without representation. So this is actually in English statute that you're meant to give self-government to each of your colonies. And ultimately, through some fortuitous circumstances, the Russell Whig government, which has sort of been denying self-government to the Australian colonies, it falls. And on 15 December 1852, there's a reply issued by the new Secretary for State, John Packingham, which says that he's going to acquiesce and that the Australian colonies are ultimately going to be given self-government based on this appeal to Magna Carta.
It's interesting, though, that the British, for the American colony, had not seen that was an inherent sort of English convention through the centuries of Magna Carta by that stage. I mean, was that just because they, saw British people living in America as sort of some lesser subjects, or what was the thinking around that?
Well, there's two things. One of them is actually international law from a couple of hundred years ago, which said that if a territory was conquered as opposed to settled, that the conquering government could do whatever it wanted, that there were no rights that came with it. But if it was settled, that all those rights were expected to come with it. So terra nullius in the Australian context meant that British law interpreted us as a settlement rather than an invasion, so we got a better end of the deal. But the other thing that the British did is, for the most part, they did a sort of loophole where what they were imposing wasn't direct taxes, but tariffs, and tariffs were considered to be external taxes. So it was not quite the same thing. But in response to the 7 Years' War, which is this war that George Washington starts with Quebec, that Britain has to pay for and wants to get money back from the American colonies because it's basically spent all this money defending the American colonies, they introduced something called the Stamp Act, which was internal taxation. And that's really the start of the rebellion.
It seems like, though, King George, wasn't it, during the American Revolution, he didn't learn the lesson of King John. I mean, if he'd known his history, he would have known that the barons of the America would come back and fight him.
Oh, I don't think he expected the American colonists to be as powerful as the barons. I mean, he probably thought he had the barons on his side and he was basically dealing with Ireland or any other sort of colonial outpost of England that would be easy to subdue. But it didn't quite work out like that, in large part because, once again, the French become involved.
The French are a recurring theme, aren't they? But so in the Australian context, of course, we're the beneficiaries of the British learning from history, learning from their mistakes. I mean, Henry Parkes later describes William Wentworth's Declaration and Remonstrance as one of the foundation stones of the fabric of our constitutional liberties. I mean, why is it those act that I mean, I must say, before preparing for today's podcast, I hadn't heard of the 1851 Declaration and Remonstrance claim. So, I mean, that could be a huge failure on my part and my education, but I suspect not many people in Australia have heard of it.
Well, that's just the sort of the sad thing. That the really exciting battle for democracy, and it's obviously never going to be as exciting as America with the Revolutionary War because there's no war involved. It's a peaceful battle for democracy. But that battle is actually waged in the 1840s and 50s, not at federation, but because it's sort of separate stories. Each of the colonies are still separate. It's harder to weave into a sort of national foundational myth, even though we were all interconnected. It was only really WA that was left out of the response to the Declaration and Remonstrance. It wasn't just that Wentworth won self-government for New South Wales. He simultaneously won self-government for Victoria and Queensland and South Australia and Tasmania. So it really affected all of us.
So, Magna Carta today, what sort of validity does it have in our laws?
So it is part of Australian law because of the various imperial application acts, and it's in 1828 that we get sort of holus bolus the existing statutes that it then in England become part of Australian law. But the key thing to remember with it is that it is just an ordinary statute. So people have this idea that it is fundamental law, that they're appealing to Magna Carta because that will uphold their rights in a way that other legislation won't. That is a battle that is fought out through the centuries, and in certain ways informs the American idea of a Bill of Rights and that you do have fundamental things that can't be overridden. But in the British tradition that we inherit, parliamentary sovereignty wins out, so you can actually override Magna Carta with ordinary statute. And it does tend to be those two sort of due process clauses that are the really important ones for us here in Australia.
Yeah, so the judgment of his peers, so I guess trial by jury, and the promise not to sell, refuse, or delay justice. And to this day, you often get people challenging delays of justice. In terms of the COVID era restrictions on our liberty, people were invoking Magna Carta. I mean, what did you think of that as someone who's written a book on freedom's symbol over a millennium?
Well, yeah, it shows it still has this emotive power, but it's ultimately COVID shows one of the central arguments of the book, and one of the central arguments of the book is that is cultural norms that actually protect liberties. It's that you have to have a large enough proportion of the society accept that individual rights are a good thing and worth upholding, and then they will be upheld. But if the majority of people are more populist and don't really think like that, it doesn't matter how much you spill ink trying to defend them, they ultimately won't be defended. And that's what happened during COVID. COVID actually had a very direct violation of one of the clauses of Magna Carta, which is one of the clauses of Magna Carta says that you are free to go in and out of the kingdom in peacetime as you wish. So the restrictions on Australians leaving the country were a direct violation of Magna Carta. But again, it's not something that you could really get upheld in court.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, Magna Carta was just but a mere statute, a mere piece of law that could have been overridden, and of course was overridden. Now, Australia has its own copy of Magna Carta, which is an extraordinary, I think, purchase, and it was made, of course, by a certain Prime Minister that we know very well, Robert Menzies. Can you tell this amazing story, Zach?
Yeah, They basically, so it's the King's School in Somerset in the 1930s, basically discovers out of the blue that they happen to have a copy of Magna Carta, and by the
As you do.
as you do, and by the early
My school had some amazing ancient documents. Didn't yours, Zach?
oh yeah, but the funnier thing is that in more recent uh, times, even since I did the article on our website explaining Magna Carta, apparently it had been erroneously sent to that school. It was a like London legal organization that was trying to make a donation to a different organization, and it basically put it in the wrong envelope. I don't know how you put a document that is that large in the wrong envelope, but that's ultimately how they ended up with it. But they weren't going to waste the opportunity. Being a cash-strapped school, they thought, well, this is an opportunity to make a lot of money. They took it to the British Museum to get it assessed and authenticated, and they got a really paltry offer from the British Museum for the purchase. So instead, they took it to Sotheby's, which is one of the world's largest auction houses that's still going around today. And they shopped it around, and ultimately Menzies made the purchase for what has turned out to be very much a bargain bin price.
Yeah, so it's £12,500 in 1952, and I did put it into ChatGPT, and it was something like $250,000 or something. But actually, I think the Parliamentary Library has valued it at $35 million, which even to me sounds like it was undervalued. It is, as MasterCard would say, priceless. But this is really Menzies Blue Polls moment, isn't it?
Yeah, so Menzies really cares about Magna Carta for two reasons. One is that he has this Whig view of history as this constant fight for liberties where we've gradually won more and more liberties. And he understands that Magna Carta in and of itself doesn't do anything for democracy. The barons weren't interested in democracy. They're ultimately interested in their own self-interest. But what he says is that it sees the imagination of men of intelligence. And that's ultimately its historical importance, is that it became this symbol, this thing to fight for, even if what you are ultimately fighting for was far broader and more universal than what was in the original document. And the other one is the quote you used at the start there, where that this put into words for the first time something that had been instinctive in Britain since the beginning of time, which again really speaks to the thesis of the book, that it is ultimately a cultural phenomenon. I mean, you can go all the way back to Tacitus describing the Germans, who were the Anglo-Saxons, and he's talking about them as a remarkably democratic people. And you had in the Anglo-Saxon era this thing called the Witan, which was a proto-parliament where there was a lot of consultation and consent to lawmaking and to tax raising. And this is what the Normans, who had then conquered, were then invoking. They might have been very sort of racist and prejudiced against the Anglo-Saxons that they had conquered, but they were still going to culturally appropriate something that gave them more rights. And Henry I and Henry III were both big history nerds. They actually really cared about that Anglo-Saxon past. I mean, Henry III names his son Edward after Edward the Confessor. So this is where the Anglo-Saxon name Edward then becomes part of this sort of Norman monarchy.
Now, I have realised it's 1:29. We've got seconds more of our one-on-one discussion, but it's almost time for the audience's questions. So if you haven't put a question in the box below, please do. I can see a few coming in, quite a few. Oh my goodness, a lot. So Zach, we're going to have to do a quick fire round. I did have one final question. As host, I'm going to, use that right, about Menzies' view on a Bill of Rights, because I think this is, it's obviously very linked to his views on Magna Carta, but he was, I guess you'd be unsurprised to hear this, opposed to having a formalised Bill of Rights, and you can explain why that was.
Oh, so yeah, it's something that comes up in the debate over the powers referendum in the middle of World War II, where basically to sweeten the deal for all these extended powers to the government, they're going to introduce a couple of rights, one of which is freedom of speech. And Menzies argues that in this context, that Magna Carta was an artifact of a time where the king was sovereign and you had to put limitations on the king. But now that the people are sovereign, it's ridiculous for the sovereign people to make a list of things that they can and can't do. And he ultimately makes the argument I was just making before, that it is the culture, that it is the norms that are going to uphold things like freedom of speech. And if the Australian electorate is ever so basically drunk as to give away all these rights, then something written down won't do anything about it. We've already lost the battle at that point.
Well, yes. So he does say we are British people and we do not need to be reminded that we have inherited these established principles of government from our English ancestors, and that we do not need some solemn piece of writing in a constitution to make us completely determined that our inherited freedoms will not be taken away from us either by despots or by elected persons. In the last resort, it will be found that only the real assurance of freedom will be a real spirit of freedom in the minds of these people. And then your allusion to drunk, but if the people at any time became so carried away as to seek to destroy these freedoms, which are of our lifeblood, no pretty little form of words in the Constitution, which they themselves made, would prevent them from doing it. So there you go. To your audience questions, I'm going to start with Caroline. Thank you, Caroline, for your question. Zach, Caroline's asked, what role and contribution, if any, do you think the education sector can play to increase the knowledge of the relevance and importance of the Magna Carta in our modern day societies?
Well, I think
very good question.
I think Magna Carta is a real clear embodiment of the power of the narrative, that people for centuries got indoctrinated in this idea that people had fought hard for their liberties and that they were the successors to those battles and that they had to fight to uphold them. And I think that that's something that our education system is not as good at these days, that we don't like to have those foundational narratives. We like to have a bit more sort of nuance and dissection, which is all well and good at maybe the university level. But I think that when you're talking about people from a younger age, that you need to get more excited about civics education and all these things that we're able to track we're doing really poorly at the moment. Having a bit of that sort of inspiration, I think, would be really important. And it's certainly something you see with, say, a Robert Menzies. Every child of the 1890s in Australia would have been spoon-fed this Whig view of history as this constant battle for freedom that had been fought and won. And we obviously don't want it as simplistic as it was in the 1890s, but maybe a bit more of that might make people a bit more excited.
So get back to basics. We've got a question from Gary. Thank you, Gary. Are there any threats to the ongoing significance of the Magna Carta?
Well, I would say that if the point of Magna Carta is that it's cultural norms that uphold our freedoms, I think that societies that become more and more fractured, that have less and less cultural norms, that's the real threat. I mean, it's really interesting to read the Hansard of the day in which we received our 1297 copy. It was the speaker who officially received it rather than Menzies, because the idea was that it was the Parliament receiving it, and the speaker is the representative of Parliament rather than the Prime Minister. And both Menzies and the opposition leader at the time, Herbert Everett, give these real, like, emotive and beautiful speeches about all that Magna Carta means to them. Herbert Everett had actually been a sort of amateur historian who's written a few history books over the years. So he was really just as excited about this as Menzies. And what that shows is that in the 1950s in Australia, for all the sort of partisan squabbles, these two leaders still were part of this same culture. They'd been part of the same education system. They'd been taught to believe in basically the same things. They just had different interpretations of how best to get there. But I would say that in Australia in 2025, that's less and less the case. People believe now in fundamentally different things. So those norms aren't there, and the ability to have healthy democratic debate and healthy transfers of power can become under threat when that happens.
Yeah, yeah. And do you think there is a problem? Some people find it problematic talking about Magna Carta because it is a British, it's an inheritance from Britain, and there's that kind of is some trends in Australia that don't want to share in that heritage or see that heritage as bringing a lot of tragedy to Australia, and so that undermines perhaps some of those really foundational discussions we should be having about Magna Carta and the importance of the principles.
Oh, yes. Look, 100%. And I actually bring that up in the conclusion to the book. I actually bring up the fact that, I'm an Irish Catholic. I know that there's a far less triumphalist version of British history that is happening simultaneously with the story of Magna Carta. It is not all good things. But that doesn't mean we throw out the baby with the bathwater when something is so good and so foundational to setting up our liberal democracy and the freedoms it upholds. I mean, if the barons of the 1200s can selectively culturally appropriate from people they're prejudiced against, I think there is room to sort of look past things like that.
Yeah, it's part of the culture, the convention. Another question here from our audience. Thank you, Cliff Reese, for your question. How many original copies of Magna Carta still exist? This is a good, pub quiz question.
Oh, I don't have that off the back of my head. I do know that the 1297 copy,
which is the one we have,
is particularly rare, such that the British Museum, certainly as of maybe 10 years ago, I don't know if they've discovered one since, but they didn't have a copy. And at the time, it was actually really controversial for Australia's copy to leave Britain. There were people who tried to put in a lot of roadblocks to stop Australia's copy from leaving Britain. And Australia remains one of only two nations in the world outside of Britain to have a copy, the other being the United States, who has theirs proudly displayed in the Library of Congress.
Yeah, well, and ours is proudly displayed in our Parliament House. I think it was... do you renovate? You restore. Sorry, you restore. They restored the Magna Carta we have a few years ago, and it's proudly on display. I've got a lot of questions from our friend Anonymous, so thank you, Anonymous, whoever you are. Are there aspects of the Magna Carta that you think are overemphasized?
Well, I actually have sort of done the opposite in this book, that a lot of historians have treated Magna Carta with this air of very strict realism, that 1215 didn't say no taxation without representation. Therefore, that has nothing to do with Magna Carta. Whereas I take the view that even if it was a myth, the fact that the myth became reality means that it is an essential part of the story of Magna Carta. So I actually argue the opposite, that the constitutional legacy is far greater than a reading of just the document alone would allow. But certainly its legal legacy is overblown to the extent that, as we've talked about, it doesn't have that great a legal effect anymore. Even those clauses which can be invoked have a pretty poor track record of being upheld in the Australian courts. So it's often people who are doing their own self-representation and sort of crackpots that really want to make Magna Carta front and center in their legal case, although it has been important in some very important legal cases in Australia over the years. most importantly, the High Court overturning the Communist Party Dissolution Act.
Well, we do have a question about that from, again, our friend Anonymous. So sorry I can't give you a shout out, but make sure if you put a question that you give us your name, because I love to shout out. What do communist parties in the Menzies era, as well as today, think about the Magna Carta? Well, obviously probably quite liked it.
Well, yeah, they obviously communist parties are not going to appeal to culturally derived liberties and rights, and it is something that it's remarkable how long this idea of Magna Carta of claiming rights not from progress and through making things better, but through appealing to an idealized past that lasts for centuries and centuries. And it really is only in sort of 1750s onwards that Western societies start to develop this sort of cult of progress. But as the Communist Party Dissolution Act demonstrates, that while people of that sort of radical political persuasion might not uphold or venerate Magna Carta in the same way, it can still really protect them if they're part of these societies that value these things.
I mean, in that judgment, Justice Dudley Williams specifically said that the Communist Party Dissolution Act was contrary to Magna Carta. I mean, can you explain that further?
Well, I think that would have a lot to do with the reversal of the onus of proof. The reversal of the onus of proof was the most controversial aspect of the Communist Party Dissolution Act and ultimately the referendum around bending the Communist Party. The opinion polls showed that everyone was happy with the idea, like it was 80% were happy with the idea of banning the Communist Party, but the devil was in the details. And the reversal of the onus of proof, the idea was that you didn't want ASIO having to reveal its sources every time it tried to prosecute someone for being a communist. So you would just make those people that ASIO thought were communists prove that they were not, which is obviously incredibly problematic and was arguably rightly overruled. But it still showed that that's an embodiment of that idea of due process, that by the law of the land, that to reverse the onus of proof is a violation of the law of the land. It goes against everything that the common law tradition of British liberty had evolved to uphold.
So this isn't a question, but it's interesting bit of background here from Gary Humphries, who's a former Chief Minister of the Australian Capital Territory, the ACT. Gary says, while I was ACT Attorney General, my department proposed as part of a legislative clean-out to repeal the remaining provisions of Magna Carta from the ACT statute book. I declined this suggestion. And he says, hopefully they're still there. I mean, we don't know. A bit of a research project for someone, but very interesting that the Magna Carta made it onto the ACT statute book.
That is because you can already override it with new legislation. So to actually root and branch, remove it, it's an interesting instinct to have.
Well, indeed. This is an interesting question from, again, Anonymous. Thank you, Anonymous. What is the legacy of the Magna Carta in Robert Menzies' policies?
Oh, that is.
It's not having a Bill of Rights because he saw it as unnecessary because it was already part of our culture to uphold our freedoms and fight for our freedoms. And if we weren't going to, then it was, our fault.
And also Menzies had this idea. He was very British in the idea of he actually wanted a bit of an evolutionary constitution. He didn't actually want too rigid of a constitution. That was something that happened by necessity because of the necessities of a federal compact between 6 existing colonies. But the British liked the fact that their constitution had been able to adapt to change over the years and had centuries and centuries of evolution and tried and true sort of proof is in the pudding argument behind it. The other thing about Menzies is I think that he was ultimately just a gradualist. And this is something that comes out very strongly in Sir Edward Cook, who's the person who really brings Magna Carta to the forefront of the battles with Charles I in the early part of the 1600s. He has the Petition of Right, which is this attempt to clarify what Magna Carta actually means, and in clarifying, they're actually extending what Magna Carta means. And he has this famous statement where he says, Magna Carta is such a fellow that they will have no sovereign. But he's really important in codifying the common law and writing about the common law. And he says that the common law has this collective wisdom of multiple generations that is greater than what any individual human could reason from abstract principles alone. I think Menzies takes a certain approach like that, that there has to be an overwhelming case made for a change, because ultimately Australian democracy is working pretty well. So the onus of the burden of proof, ironically, in this case, is always on proving that change will be a good thing. So he's a gradualist. He really respects all that's gone into creating our successful system.
Another question from, I'm afraid, anonymous again, but please keep putting your questions in and make sure we know your name. How has the iconography of Magna Carta been used accurately or otherwise by political parties in Australia? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, that is an interesting question. I know that, say, it's not quite a political party, but something that's really foundational to the evolution of Australian democracy is obviously the Chartist movement. And there's a reason that the Chartists are called the Chartists. They have a charter that they want to implement, which is this democratic reform that includes annual elections, the secret ballot, universal manhood suffrage, equal electorates, things like that. The reason they're using the word charter is because it has so much emotive power, because it's ultimately linked with Magna Carta. So there's this way in which things that, again, have nothing to do with 1215, they're still drawing on Magna Carta. And even one of the monuments at Runnymede is a monument to JFK. And there's no direct link between Kennedy and Magna Carta, but it's this sort of amorphous ideal of liberty that the person who's erected this monument clearly feels that both embodies.
I mean, during the COVID-19 pandemic, there were various, probably smaller political parties who were pushing back against some of the restrictions on liberties. Did you see that sort of use of Magna Carta as a sort of totemic issue come out there? And so I'm thinking of sort of, Clive Palmer. He obviously launched the case against the WA state government over its very strict lockdown of the state from the rest of Australia. I mean, was it used in or invoked in those situations?
I'm sure it would have been, like, I don't have, like, I'm sure you could Google.
I'm putting you on the spot, I know.
United Australia Party Magna Carta, and there'd be plenty of results. But it is this debate over whether there are sort of fundamental laws that you can't override, that there are fundamental individual rights and freedoms that, say, a Magna Carta or a Bill of Rights put up, that it doesn't matter what a majority think should be the law, and a majority were clearly in favor of lockdowns, that there are certain basic individual freedoms that you can just never override, no matter how much you've got a democratic majority. But again, as I said, that tradition, that debate was alive and well. Edward Cook tried to overturn, in one of his cases, his legal cases, he suggested that a statute could be overturned because it was in opposition to Magna Carta. It was a case called Bonham's case. But that tradition ultimately died out in England. Parliamentary sovereignty won through the 17th century. And when it won it in absolutist terms. When you had the king as the arbitrary power, they were never as sovereign as the parliament was, because they had the church that could stand up to them, or the barons that could stand up to them. There was lots of checks and balances. But the parliament, because it's meant to already be the voice of the people, doesn't have the same level of checks and balances.
You would say that that was also part of the sort of Menzian idea of the real supremacy of Parliament. I mean, he really sort of, I think, elevated Parliament above government. And these days, perhaps we get less of that from our leaders. I mean, you particularly see those tensions playing out in the United States, where the executive is seeking to really overlook even the whole purpose and role of Congress, and Australia to a lesser extent. But where an executive can ignore the legislature, why not?
Well, it's a bit different because obviously we have responsible government. So you need to have a majority in the House of Representatives to be the executive. But that doesn't mean that the executive has not hollowed out every single power it can from the parliament to sort of be an oversight. And the majoritarianism of responsible government has facilitated that, because as soon as you're in government, you already have the majority in the House of Representatives. So you're in a position to manipulate the standing orders and do all the manipulate question time, do all the things you can to really minimize scrutiny. And I think that Menzies, and even to a certain extent Abbott, they were of this older tradition. They knew that the rights of Parliament had been so hard fought for, and they were a lot more reluctant to diminish them, even though in practice, I'm sure they did diminish them in several ways.
Another question here from Anonymous that I think would is linked to just what you've said. You mentioned the idea of Magna Carta being sort of part of a national myth when it comes to teaching young people. This person asks, how should we approach the Magna Carta? Should we live the principles in democratic practice, or try to put symbolic weight on it and make it a stronger part of our national myth?
Yeah, I like the symbolic weight. I mean, it says that the title of the book is Freedom Symbol Over a Millennium. And I think that having those symbols and those stories is really what's going to inspire young people. I don't think that young people are going to be that excited about not selling or delaying right or justice. I mean, that's fundamental to what Magna Carta does in establishing due process. But I don't think that's the exciting part of the story. I think that constitutional fight, that fight through which Parliament emerges, through which Australian democracy emerges, I think that's ultimately how you appeal to young people. And this idea that those fights are never over. That's the whole thing, is that there's so many battles that have to be fought several times over the 800 years since Magna Carta. Like they think that Magna Carta in 1297 has established that there won't be any taxes levied without the consent of the Commons. Yet that's not what Charles I thinks in the 1600s. These battles are ongoing, and that's what I think will inspire a younger generation, is to understand where they are in the grand procession, is the Menzies phrase, that they're the inheritors of all these things, but the responsibility that comes with inheriting all these things is that then you have to go out and fight the battles and defend them, and there will be battles to have to defend them.
And I guess flowing on from that, another question, again from Anonymous. What does the acquisition of Magna Carta by the Menzies government say about how Menzies saw the link between history and our national identity?
I think that he saw Australia in terms of its liberal democracy, that it's actually one of the defining aspects of Australian history, that, we're one of the world's oldest democracies, but so much of our history as it is played out since 1788. Obviously, there's a whole far longer history before 1788, but so much of our history since 1788 has been these battles for democracy, and then these battles within democracy, our parliamentary battles and these sorts of things. So I think he would have seen Magna Carta as being fundamentally Australian. I don't know if he knew about Wentworth's Declaration and Remonstrance. He might have been too much of a Victorian for that. But he would have seen that our identity is interwoven with how we live up to the challenge of upholding these freedoms that we've inherited.
I mean, there's an incredible story of the sort of exceptional nature of our development of our democracy, that it was so peacefully won in a way, that we developed such a universal suffrage so quickly compared to other Anglosphere countries. I mean, why is it that we don't celebrate that, Zach?
I mean, there's a famous case that so a lot of the story of Australian history when it comes to liberal democracy is this idea of taking British premises and then expanding on them. And that starts from day one. So in the First Fleet, there's a convict who has their luggage goes missing, and they successfully sue the captain of the ship for losing their luggage as a convict. Yeah. And this is something that they would not have had the legal standing to do in Britain at the time. That as a convict, you wouldn't be able to make such an argument in the law.
Luggage was around 250 years ago, is what you're saying.
Yeah, the lost luggage. But no, the fact that even directly as the First Fleet is arriving, you're getting a broader understanding of British liberty than exists in Britain. And the same happens over and over again as far as us having universal male suffrage so much earlier than Britain, us having female suffrage so much earlier than Britain, us pioneering the secret ballot, pioneering preferences and compulsory voting and all these sorts of things. But it's both. It's that we create a uniquely Australian tradition by respecting what we've inherited and then building on it. It's not that you have to have something that's so essentially Australian that it means a rejection of the past, because it's ultimately the roots that make democracy work. And it's because we were able to inherit so much of that culture that it set a stable platform to then build from that, to build a more successful democracy than existed in Britain.
Do you think there's something in the nature of Australian culture that isn't triumphalist enough about our success of our democracy? I mean, is it, I mean, maybe that's a good thing in a way, but you look at, say, the United States, and they're so proud that they won their freedoms, that they have this democracy, and, with all its, huge flaws, and yet we feel quite complacent, I think.
Yeah, well, it's not just the foundational thing about the American Revolution and having to fight for rights that we were able to petition for successfully. It's also that so many of the American colonies were founded by these religious dissenters who went there to create a new and better world. Whereas a lot of Australians, it's not only were we a sort of a convict dumping ground, but where you go to get away from the world. I don't think we have the same sort of aspirations of building something better, even though we have done it. And it's probably, we've been more successful because of our modesty. It's because we didn't try to design something from scratch, but because we sort of took what we already knew, took what had been proven as successful and tinkered with it. That's been the more successful strategy than trying to create something grand from first principles.
Do you look across the Anglosphere, Zach, and have a sense that we got it better than most?
I do. Obviously, that where we have flaws like any other society, and you could talk about our treatment of Indigenous Australians or maybe white Australia, but I would also talk about we have this culture of obedience that revealed itself in the lockdowns. I mean, we are the descendants of the jailers as much as the jailed. So not everything is perfect, but I think it is that modesty that ultimately shines through in Australia's success. Is that like that phrase, the lucky country, implies that we don't know why we're successful. And we don't know why we're successful because we never tried too hard to succeed. We have these low ambitions that we always, promise less and deliver more. That's the Australian way.
Yeah. Well, on that lovely note, thank you very much, Zach Gorman, for bringing to life Magna Carta for us once again. I hope to our audience you learned something and can share it with your friends and family, and we can take pride rather in the inheritance we have. We have a wonderful event coming up next month I wanted to let you know about, celebrating the Scottish Enlightenment, the legacy of Adam Smith and Robert Burns. And we have Professor Chris Berg and Dr. David Kemp joining us to talk about those really key figures in that movement. And that's part of the Melbourne Tartan Festival. We're holding that on the 23rd of July here in the Robert Menzies Institute Museum at 5:30 p.m. And finally, it is the end of financial year. So if you had the inclination, capacity, and generosity, please consider contributing to our appeal. We really, really value any support we receive. And of course, it means we can do more and more wonderful things like today's live webinar. So thank you very much for joining us.